Hello, I think we are live. Okay, so I'm happy and I want to welcome you on our webinar and about the migration from Vue to Vue 3. And today we have two experts from Monterail. First one is Szymon Lisał, front-end principal engineer, and Artur Rosa, front-end architect. And I'll give you the mic for Artur.
Hello, you all. So it's great to have you here. It's great to be here. So at the very beginning, let me briefly tell you who we are and why we are talking about technology, and especially why are we talking about Vue. So we are Monterail. Our mission is to deliver meaningful software. And we have a lot of great success stories with Vue. We successfully used Vue 2 in our projects. We used Vue 1 before. And I must admit, we kind of love Vue. And now you will probably understand why, when our development team found out that Vue 3 is about to be released, we immediately wanted to start using it. But it turned out that even though the stable version of Vue 3 was released in September 2020, the ecosystem of Vue needed quite some time to catch up. So for a long time, the migration of our projects seemed to be a really tough task. The main reason was that in a lot of those projects, we had critical dependencies that did not support Vue 3 yet. But now we are in a totally different moment. So the ecosystem of Vue 3 is already pretty strong. The tools are battle tested, used on production, and Vue 3 became the default version of Vue, and so it became a default for us in Monterail. So when we are starting new projects with Vue, Vue 3 is the way to go for us. But the time has come to start thinking and reconsider migrating of some existing projects that we have. Another reason to start thinking about it is that Vue 2 is already fixed when it comes to new features. It is now in the maintenance mode. This maintenance mode means that basically Vue team will still fix newly found bugs, but will not add any new features. It means that Vue 2 applications will still work as before till the end of 2023. Yes, 2023, because at the end of 2023, Vue 2 will reach end of life. So after this date, Vue 2, the version 2 of the framework Vue, will no longer receive any updates, including security updates and browser compatibility fixes. And I know it may sound scary, but it is good to know and understand what does it mean in practice. But basically, this is the final reason why you should at least consider the migration. And this is why we are organizing this webinar. So today we want to show you our perspective and our thoughts on this subject. I won't lie to you, migrating a complex Vue 2 application is not easy. This is why we want to help you decide whether the migration is a way to go or not, but we will also tell you a little bit about our approach to the migration and how to make this process easier and minimize costs and risks. If there is anything you want to ask, you will some question will appear. Make sure to write them down and write them in the comment section, and we'll try to answer them at the end of the meeting during the Q&A session. Let me start with this. What does it mean that Vue 2 will reach end of life? So I already said a little bit about it, but let me reframe the question. The natural question is, what will happen with already existing Vue 2 projects when the maintenance is over, so after 2023? I'll give you a second with this very deep thought. Well, probably nothing special for quite some time. So newly found bugs won't be fixed for Vue 2. But Vue 2 is already a very stable and battle-tested framework. So it should not be a big problem. There might be some issues support in new versions of browsers sometime from now, but we are not expecting it to happen in the foreseeable future. So such things did not appear since today very often, and we are not expecting them to happen more often. But at this point, I think I should mention that the same risk applies to community-driven Vue 2 libraries and other third-party dependencies. So with Vue end of life, it is very likely that most Vue 2 libraries won't see an update. So here the risk should be assessed per project. So depending on how much critical parts of your project depend on external libraries written for Vue, I think that special attention should be given to integrations with external services, because such integrations may simply stop work and the vendor can only make changes for Vue 3. The other problem at some point may be libraries that are using some unstable browser APIs, which of course may change. So in a standard scenario, the author would probably release a new version of the library, but here it may not be so. Another aspect that should not be underestimated is developers. So as time goes by, it will become increasingly difficult to find people who will be willing to work with end-of-life technologies. And as I mentioned, it's more of a theoretical problem that Vue 2 itself will suddenly stop working due to some browser support issues or that significant security vulnerabilities will be discovered. But for some projects, the problem may simply be the fact of having end-of-life technology in stack. So this may be due to, for example, regulations or company policies or the SLA signed. I won't go much into details, but Vue team, with the cooperation with their external partner, company offered some paid solution for such cases. It is called Extended Long-Term Support for Vue 2. If you are interested, make sure to check the link that is visible on the slide right now. Okay, so I said about the risks, but another question is, what are the benefits of the migration? So it's not that an upgrade will only get rid of future problems, because the effort can be actually rewarded quite immediately after the migration is complete. So the question is what we can gain. And let me start with the performance. So I'm not a fan of saying, oh, by how much percent the application will speed up, because it really depends on many factors. But the truth is that in almost all cases, Vue 3 is faster than the previous version. And it can be quite a noticeable change for some applications. Performance not only has a significant impact on UX and how users perceive an application, but it can also affect the search engine optimization. If that's important for your project, then you should probably be aware of that. In Vue 2 introduced a number of new features, such as composition API, teleport, suspense, or multiple root elements per template. So those functionalities opens up completely new possibilities for creating a maintainable and scalable architecture. Again, it's especially important for complex application. Vue team has ported back some of those features to Vue 2 with version 2.7, but only part of them and with additional limitations. To take full advantage of them, migration is necessary. And as I mentioned about performance, those new features also can support it because they provide new ways of sharing logics. Yeah, won't go into technical details, but it's not only that those are new possibilities for developers, but it can impact actually how the application works. When creating Vue 3, the core team was very much focused on the developer experience. So it means how the tools are used by developers and to make them happy and to help them as much as possible. And my impression is that this focus has become a mainstream across the whole Vue ecosystem. So take a look at the new tools in Vue ecosystem like Vite, vtest, Next3, or libraries such as Pinga or Vue use. Those all libraries works with virtually no configuration, are super fast, lightweight, and intuitive. So thanks to Vue 2.7, again, it is still possible to use some of new libraries developed mostly for Vue 3 in Vue 2 applications, but unfortunately only a tiny part of them. Think about it like this. If someone at this point is just creating a library for Vue that can significantly help in the development of your application, they're probably only doing it for Vue 3. So Vue 3 is already very strong. The ecosystem of Vue 3 is already very strong, but we believe it will develop much, much more in the future. Another thing is TypeScript support. So Vue 3, but also a major part of Vue 3 libraries and tooling has much better TypeScript support. And this is beneficial not only for people that are actually using TypeScript, because thanks to this, code editors can help us developers more doing our work. But we also have more options for ensuring the stability of the software. So speaking a little bit less technical, at this point, it allows to statically analyze the code of the entire application. So when used well, it can definitely support peaceful sleep. And the last but not least, I want to mention that there are some upcoming features of Vue 3. And as a sneak peek, let me just mention the plans for this year. So for the first half of this year, among other things, the Vue core team plans to work on lazy hydration and server-side rendering only parts of templates. I know it's a little bit deep technically, but if you are a performance geek, if you know something about performance and you are using server-side rendering in your application, you know that those are actually very important features to have. But for the second half of this year, the plan is to ship Vapor mode. And at the recent Vue conferences, Evan talked a little bit about it, about Vapor mode. And it is an alternative compilation strategy for Vue components inspired by Solid framework. And believe me, this could be a game changer for applications that require an extreme performance. And unfortunately, there is no hope for those new features to be ported back to version 2. And keep in mind that those are only plans for this year. Vue 3 is complete rewrite of the framework. So this is also the reason why the migration is hard, but this made it, Vue 3, a foundation that gives Vue creators much more freedom to build on top of it. So we don't know what other improvements and features will appear in the coming years, but we have high expectations here. And maybe at this point, you may be thinking, okay, I'm convinced, so what should I do with it? And to find some answers, I will pass the virtual mic to my colleague, Shimon.
Thank you, Artur. Perhaps it's time to answer the important question of who should actually migrate from Vue 2 to Vue 3. You know the benefits, it might sound enticing, but still, it's not as simple as one might think, because in some cases, it might not necessarily be a good choice, or perhaps even not a possibility. So, before we start diving into things deeper, let me bring you back a quote from Ivan Yu from last year from the Vue report. So what Ivan basically says is that we should basically approach it on a case-by-case basis. And essentially, if Vue 2 works for you, and it works for you well, and then perhaps maybe it might not be worth it because it might not be a cost-effective solution. So you should really consider a lot of different factors. And I think that this quote, because the situation changed quite a bit. When Ivan said it, there was no end of life announced for Vue 2. But I think that the point essentially still stands. We need to evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. and essentially take a closer look on some factors. So some of the factors might give you a decision quite easily, because they might be some cases where the decision might not be as hard to make as you think. So let's take a look at, for example, the size of your application. If you have a small application that works reliably for a long time, it's made in Vue 2, and it works just fine, then perhaps because it's small, it might not be worth it to migrate it. It's a small application after all, and well, it's perhaps the resources could be allocated just elsewhere. Likewise, if you have an application that you are not necessarily building new features for, or maybe you are doing so, but in a limited fashion, maybe it's just mostly maintenance, then perhaps this might be too costly for you because it would require additional resources spent just to migrate. Perhaps then staying with Vue 2 might be a better option. And finally, if your application is built with support for older browsers in mind, such as Internet Explorer 11, maybe older, then, well, I have bad news for you, and maybe you already know this, but Vue 3 doesn't support these browsers. You have to stay with Vue 2, and essentially that's all the choice you can make. Still, there are some actions you can take to improve the code base and basically with Vue 2.7, which I'll talk about later, but essentially there is no option to migrate. Now, there are also some technical factors which might influence the complexity of the migration. There's a lot of them. This list is quite a bit long, but it's definitely not full and not complete. So, for example, you might want to look on how many dependencies you have that do not have Vue 3 support in your project. How important are they? Do you have any alternatives for them? Now, does your app use non-public Vue APIs, which now you cannot do so in Vue 3? Does your app rely on behavior that changed between Vue 2 and Vue 3? Do you follow best practices? Maybe there are areas where your team wants to do some refactoring because, well, old code might not be so nice, and that will require additional work. And, well, migration is a perfect place for it, but still, it's additional work involved to migrate. Now, there's, of course, the case where you might be using non-standard syntax, such as class-based components. Maybe you are using SSR, maybe it might be a custom solution, maybe you are doing it with Nuxt, and, well, using Nuxt itself is additional complexity because it's a big framework and a lot of things changed for Nuxt between Nuxt 2 and Nuxt 3. Also, likewise, if you're using an UI framework, well, it's another additional complexity involved with migration. It's not all bad, though, because there are actually some beneficial factors. For example, if you have high test coverage in your application, that's excellent. This will make you be much more confident when you are changing your application to be sure that it works and you are not introducing new bugs or errors because, well, migration is actually quite a scary process that can also bring some risks. Likewise, if you have not that many external dependencies for a project, maybe it's mostly just Vue and some small dependencies, not that many, then the migration might be a straightforward process. Maybe just the Vue migration guideline might be just what you need, and it won't take that much time or effort. But, like I've said, the migration is also a risky process. Essentially, if you think about migration, it's essentially a change that affects your whole application. And as you can imagine, changing your whole application can change a lot of areas and introduce bugs where you do not expect them to. And of course, this is bad because we do not want to negatively impact your users. Likewise, because it's such a big thing, it's harder to accurately estimate, well, how much time or effort the migration would need, because there's just so many uncertainties involved, and basically approaching the work one step at a time will also uncover new unknown things, which will increase the workload. So, if you would like to ask me a question of how much time will migrating your project take, it's essentially really hard and depends on a lot of factors, which you have to carefully look at. Still, even if you do not decide to migrate, or you do not want to migrate, or perhaps you want to move the migration later on because, well, now you do not have resources for it, there are still some good steps you can take to improve your code base. For example, you can move away from Vue CLI and Webpack to Vite, the new recommended approach to building your applications. This brings up some improved speed of building your application and also some improved development experience and much simpler configuration. Also, if you haven't already upgraded your Vue version in your project to Vue 2.7, I highly recommend that because, as Artur has said, there is a lot of features backported from Vue 3 here, such as composition API, script setup, support for new libraries such as vuejs, better TypeScript support, better tooling. All of these things that make developers fall in love with Vue 3 are mostly here. So it's really a good thing to just, upgrade to Vue 2.7 and let you enjoy the benefits from that. Because a lot of the features currently, we have almost a complete feature parity between Vue 2.7 and Vue 3. Of course, this will change with the upcoming features, but now is a good starting point to essentially, have this as your starting point will be improve your migration process speed. So in terms of actually approaching the migration, how do we at Monterail want to approach the migration? How do we look at risks and what solutions we offer? Let me talk about this for a second. So before we even begin, and it's important, we of course we need basically a bigger picture and to have it clear for us. So we need to audit the project. We need to take into consideration all the technical factors. The list I basically shown on the previous slides is a good starting point, but definitely not complete. You have to also take into consideration your resources, your timelines, whether you are actively developing your project, or maybe you have plans for some new big features, analyze it, look at its dependencies, and so on. Basically, without it, we cannot really have a clear plan. Now, in terms of actual migration, we at Monterail really value the fact that we should try and absolutely minimize the amount of risks and bugs and errors which the migration process could introduce for your users. So we at Monterail want to suggest you something that we call an incremental migration. And this process basically, as the name suggests, means that we are not treating the migration as a single step that you have your application not migrated, you have your application migrated, and it's a one giant leap from one to the other. No, we think that you should basically define smaller milestones and deploy your application more often and successfully do it with simple, smaller steps. Therefore, we'll be also minimizing the amount of risks because we'll be in control of what areas we'll be trying to affect in your application and basically have a closer eye on those areas to just be sure that we are not breaking things by accident. Likewise, if we do it on a step-by-step basis, we will have better predictability of the amount of effort we need, of the unknowns that we see, and also how much time such a given step could take. Now, if also there are no automated tests involved in your project, this is also an excellent place to introduce them, because now we'll be basically covering our bases and making sure that we are much more confident in the code that we ship to production. And this is basically the result of that means that we can continuously improve your code base and start reaping the benefits early. But it's also important to keep in mind that the migration itself does not necessarily mean you need to be blocked with the development process. It can happen alongside in parallel. This is absolutely possible. And here are some few solutions which could make it possible. The first one, probably the most obvious one, is basically using the Vue migration build. And this build is quite special because it allows you to have, on one hand, Vue 3 code, and on the other hand, Vue 2 code in one single code base, and have that built and shipped to production. Meaning you can essentially change parts of the application you want one by one, slowly migrating them over to Vue 3. And once you are done, just change the migration build to actual Vue 3 build. Now, it's not all pretty because there are some downsides to this. Essentially, the migration build will add unnecessary performance overhead to your application, and essentially also increase the bundle size. It's not really big, but if there are areas in application that are very performance critical, this might not be the way for you, because it will definitely impact those areas. Now, another solution would be quite perhaps maybe radical in its idea is to, but it's especially good if you are wanting and planning to create new features, new modules, new pages for application. is to just, well, start writing them in a new Vue 3 application. And basically now you have two applications. There are some quite, perhaps maybe not so simple issues you have to solve here, such as code sharing between the two applications and the fact that you do actually have multiple applications. But you can basically surely start writing new modern Vue 3 code and essentially slowly move over the old modules to the new application. And once you are done with that, you can sunset the old application for good. And now you have this modern, pretty Vue 3 application. This approach can also be especially helpful if you have some refactoring in mind with your code base, because this will basically mean you can do it in a very nice fashion. Also, another solution, but perhaps the most complex one, is to introduce micro frontend architecture to your application. This architecture basically means that instead of thinking of your project as one single big application, you split it into chunks and have one application that consists of smaller submodules, each working as its own small application. This approach, while introducing complexity, gives you some benefits. Essentially, each of these smaller applications might use different technology. So they might use different framework or different version of a framework. Therefore, you essentially cut your workload onto smaller pieces, which you can address in parallel or in any order you want to. You can migrate them one at a time when you need to. So in terms of potential solutions, there are definitely not all of them, but here is just a short list which you might be inspired by to see what approach you should take in your project. Now, finally, in terms of dependency issues between the two versions, here are some steps you could take to address some of them. So if you have a dependency that perhaps does not support Vue 3, but it was working fine with Vue 2, first off, you can, of course, try to find an alternative. It's not always possible, and perhaps sometimes might require additional work to tweak your code to address the differences between those two dependencies, but it's always an option. Of course, if such an alternative exists. Now, if you are not already doing so, you can also try to decouple your dependencies and basically wrap them around in a wrapper. So you have your own abstraction that uses these dependencies, which are external, inside of it. You treat it kind of like a black box, so you can essentially tweak and change the insides of it while still keeping the dependency working. This works especially well, for example, UI components. Now, there's also, of course, the option to wait for the support, especially if you know the support is coming, or, well, if you, at least the team working behind the dependency, says it is coming. We've had this case, for example, with Vuetify, but unfortunately, the Vuetify version 3 took quite a bit long time. And even on the release, it didn't really have the feature parity with Vuetify 2. Some things were missing. So while waiting might be an option, consider if it's possible, or if you really do trust the team behind it, and if it aligns with your timeline, perhaps it might be an option, but also could maybe influence your decision to perhaps wait with the migration if the dependency is very important or big. Likewise, if you do not necessarily feel confident on waiting, or perhaps you know that there is no one working on the dependency, you could always try to contribute yourself to maybe give back to the Vue ecosystem and solve this problem. And lastly, if all else fails, you can try to replace it with a custom solution. Of course, this will introduce additional work to your project, but it's definitely sort of a last resort kind of option to approach this. And to sum up the migration process and basically our approach that we suggest, it's important to keep in mind that basically not migration is also a choice, and it can be a valid choice given your project status, your resources, and so on. You can also migrate later and prepare for it. There are also steps you can take to prepare for it, like I said, with upgrading to Vue 2.7. Now, if you do plan to upgrade, keep in mind that it's important to be prepared and take a closer look. It's a big process. Even a very thorough audit will probably not address everything, and will still be not really seeing everything, because you have to essentially dive deeper to get to know the actual issues once you work on them. But still, it's a good starting point to start having a good, proper plan. And essentially, if you have a good, proper plan, migrate your application incrementally, just like we say, because this way you can essentially move features to production faster, not have it like a one big process, get in control of the risks and minimize them, because the worst thing you want is, of course, having errors presented for your users just because you are upgrading the version of the Vue framework. And of course, you can migrate the application while still actively developing your own application. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to block yourself just because of a migration. It can happen in parallel if you use proper and well thought out solutions. And that's it in terms of my presentation. So I guess we can move on to the last part of this webinar.
Thank you very much, Szymon. Thank you very much, Artur. And we could jump to the Q&A. So if you have a question, you could leave a comment and we try to answer it. Don't be shy. I think that this is a precious one, the informations that we get from Szymon and Artur, so we could solve some issues if you have questions regarding the migration. Okay, so we have a question from Justin. Can you name some good micro front-end frameworks?
Yeah, that's a very very wide question. I don't think it's that this webinar is actually a good to show some specific frameworks, especially because the micro front-end architecture is so wide phrase that it catches actually a lot. So you can actually do micro frontends without any framework. You can do micro frontend without actually any additional external tools. But I think that that first of all, there is no like one good solution for all cases. So it really depends on what you want to achieve, because micro frontend, just giving some examples. So when doing the migration, the most important thing is to actually decouple dependencies. But another cases for micro frontends are to actually share some dependencies between micro frontends, and like, for example, join those micro frontends in the runtime, not split them on the build time, but not join them on the build time. Or yet another thing is to have the whole decoupled page. So the easiest way for micro frontends, for example, when migrating a project, is to split page by page, for example. It's also kind of micro frontend-ish architecture that allows you to do a lot of new things. So then the integration can be done on the infrastructure level, or depending on if you have server-side rendering or not, on the on actually server rendering. Sorry, on the rendering server. So yeah, first of all, I would say that it really depends, and just putting some names here, it's not the best option.
Okay, so we have next questions. R3D cap. What are some typical issues that you find in migration?
Okay, so perhaps maybe I can answer that. So typically, the issues that come up are usually not related to Vue framework strictly. It's usually the dependencies. That's usually the devil in the details here, essentially, because, for example, migrating your Next application might be quite complex and challenging, especially considering the fact that many of the modules that were popular for Next 2 are still not there for Next 3. There are some alternatives, but in many cases there are not. So usually the biggest challenges are found essentially on those dependencies, and especially in dependencies that you use very thoroughly for your application. For example, you use Next as a meta framework, and for example, you paired it with Vuetify. That's quite a complex combination and definitely will require some work. There are some solutions here which the Next team proposed, and there are some ways you can mitigate it. There's the Next bridge, for example. But generally speaking, the typical issues that we find are usually with the dependencies. The Vue migration guideline, if you have an application that doesn't have many dependencies and you follow it, you are mostly you know mostly what you need to do and steps you need to take, and it's quite straightforward usually.
Okay, we have a next question. Can you let us know how much time it takes migration from Vue 2 to 3 versus 2.7 to 3? Interesting
Okay.
one.
Yeah, thank you, Harald, for this question. So basically, this also depends, but in most scenarios, migrating to version 2.7 can be counted in, I would say, hours or days. But migrating to version 3, that's a whole wider topic. So migrating to Vue 2.7 shouldn't be actually a big problem, and this is something that can be included, I would say, in just by the way as we go, not as a really big frog.
Okay. Searching for the questions. Okay. Do you have some experience with migrating Next 2 to Next 3? Can you advise something?
Okay, so I can maybe start with it. So we have some, we have some, but that's probably Shimon already mentioned about it. That this is actually the whole another topic, because we are trying to migrate not only Vue, but we are also need to follow the migration guide of the Next, and it really depends, because Next is built. The architecture of Next is based on the modules, so you can use third-party modules that are there, and it's great if you are using modules that are supported in the new version, and there are not a lot of breaking changes. But the thing with Next is that actually Next, with the version 3, introduced a lot of breaking changes, and in most cases, modules did the same. So with I can definitely advise how to start thinking about it, because this is a good case for auditing the project. So first of all, focus on the modules you have, so on the external dependencies you have, and then try to think about, of course, the scale of the application. But for the modules, the nice thing about Next modules is that in sorry, maybe not most cases, but there are a lot of Next modules that are actually not that important to be a module. So you can replace them with another solution that is not Next specific, or you can easily replace them with the custom solution, because a lot of Next modules are actually quite small. So when evaluating it, I would definitely suggest to take each module separately and think about how much it will take to actually migrate this. But for the migration, the framework itself, there is an official guide for that, and actually it's hard to say something more on top of that, because if you are using some lower level APIs that has been changed, or some private APIs of Next, then it's definitely helpful if you are aware of that. So this should be probably the first step when evaluating it. And then just follow the next migration guide.
Okay, we have also another questions regarding vuex and Pina. We also need to update from vuex to Pina. Would you suggest doing these migrations as a separate tasks? Okay, so this is the different questions. Sorry.
Yeah, I think there were a few questions about Pina, so maybe I'll try to address
Another
them
one.
all. But
Okay, so another one is on the screen. So sorry.
yeah,
I think one
absolutely.
of the most difficult parts is to migrate from vuex to Pina and advices.
So with Vuex versus Pina situation, I think the situation is quite different, and you could kind of isolate it from the Vue migration itself, because Vuex is compatible with Vue 3. There is no absolutely issues with that, but it's no longer maintained. So what you are essentially losing is that, well, not much. It still works. You can just use it with Vue 3 and move the topic for later. But if you would like to, well, try to address this migration and move from Vuex to Pina, it might not be as scary as it sounds, because Pina is very modular, and you can kind of try to combine have basically in your project both Vuex and Pina. It's not a problem to just use start introducing stores of Pina in some places, especially ones that are quite isolated, and slowly rewrite your Vuex modules to stores. The Pina guideline is actually very helpful here, so it might not be as difficult as you might think it is. But most important, I think, to realize is that Vuex migration to Pina doesn't block your Vue migration. You can still use Vuex in Vue 2, and you can still use Vuex in Vue 3. So it's absolutely not an issue, and you can address it later if you think that, for example, your stores are very big and complex. This might be an option.
Okay, so another question regarding the testing. So what client-side testing tools do you use most?
So I think there are two kind of automated tested tools that we are using, and I would say a couple of years ago, I would say it was Jest and Cypress. So depending on what is the use case. So if we want to actually click around for some bigger scenarios or end-to-end testing, that was Cypress, and for like components testing or functionality testing, unit testing, or just testing some integrations, there was Jest. But right now, we mentioned a couple times the vtest library, which is built on top of Vite, and vtest is a great testing library that actually works without additional config if you are using Vite in your project, because it shares the Vite config, and it's really fast. Just a just a word to support this thesis, this hypothesis. So the vtest team needed to put an animation to change that and the counter how many times tests were run, to visually show to the user, to the developer, that tests has been actually rerun because developers was not able to actually see that the test run happened after clicking save. So yeah, so right now I would say that's definitely vtest and Cypress when we are going with some test in browser testing.
Another question. I think remember seeing a long time ago that the Vue team were going to create migration CLI tool. Did they ever arrive?
Okay, so if we are talking about migration tool for migrating the Vue 2 application to Vue 3 application, there is something which is called migration build, and I don't think we should expect anything more from the core team. The migration build is the version of Vue that you can replace your own version in your project, you can replace the Vue version, the Vue dependency with the migration build, and it allows you to actually have a view that is compatible with Vue 2 and Vue 3, and like toggle some features, some compatibility features separately, and even split those modes, Vue 2 and Vue 3 modes, for the specific paths, so for the specific components in your application. And this migration tool is actually can be helpful in some cases, but you should not consider it as a tool for that will help migrate all projects, because it's really focused on migrating Vue itself. So the thing with the front-end framework is that the front-end project is, of course, built on top of a framework, but it uses a lot of often uses a lot of external dependencies. So if you are not using like very crucial, if you don't have any crucial dependencies in your project, then this definitely will be helpful, because with this tool, you will be probably able, after some tweaks, so after resolving some warning that you will see in the console, you will see that your application runs in the compatible mode using Vue 3 version. Yeah, but I think that this is unfortunately the best we can have right now, and I haven't heard about anything more.
So another question: it is possible to have Vue 2 and Vue 3 within one app? As we can say, I think, yeah. So you present this.
Maybe let me answer. So yes, of course, and the answer to that is the Vue migration build. It essentially allows you to have like a code compatible both with Vue 2 and Vue 3 in your project. So if you bring that to your project, Vue 2 project, you can start writing Vue 3 code, and it will work and it will build, and you can be shipped to production. However, just as I have also said in the presentation, the downside to this is increased bundle size, because now you have this version of Vue that has to be much more complex to understand both the old and the new. And also, it will negatively impact the performance. So if you had some places in your application that were struggling in this area or were really critical, this might not be the solution to go, essentially. But yes, it's absolutely possible.
I think that's the one thing, but there's also another thing. So what Shimon mentioned already with the incremental migration. So there are the ways that you can actually build an application that is built with two building blocks, Vue 2 and Vue 3, but those will be separate applications, but visible on the one page. And that is of course possible. And this is the pattern that is often used, not only for the migrating, but for example, with some micro-frontend architecture, or when you just want to embed some kind of application that is written with Vue 3. But yeah, I wanted to mention here that there is also one simple way that you can share components between Vue 2 and Vue 3 applications when you are going with this approach. So the library is called Vuedemy, and this is the library that allows you to share some code. So like have a library and have a component and build them for Vue 2 and also for Vue 3, depending on what you want to do at this particular time. So that's also probably important thing. And I see that there is also a second question here.
Yeah, the second question, I will jump to it. So are there some alternative to class components in Vue 3?
And I thought personally ask with this question because we are using class components in my current project. So yeah, the alternative is composition API. This is what I think. So class components is rejected as the idea of the next syntax for Vue 3. It was considered at some point, but the Vue core team rejected this idea and came up with composition API. And when you want to start migrating right now, the good news is that there are some beta and alpha versions for class components and also for class property decorator. So you can use them at your own risk, of course, and checking by your own if everything works correctly. But from my experience, it seems to be working quite okay. And there are also some other ways how to approach the migration of such components, because the problem is that when you're using class components, you're probably doing it because you want the TypeScript support. And if you want a TypeScript support, then like introducing composition API next to class components in the same large component, for example, is a bit tricky because you cannot share types between them. But there are some ideas to, like, I know it's very much technical, but you can actually write. There is an idea with the beta version of class components that you can write a setup function within a class components, and this solution actually can be backported to also to class components in Vue 2.7. Yeah. So there are some ways, and yeah.
Yep, and I think the next question is very connected with your answers. So about the TypeScript support and TypeScript friendly. Since Vue 3 is much more TypeScript friendly, I have a question: how do you guys manage site safety of APIs in your company? I think I could partially answer for this question because TypeScript is as a default in our company on the front-end technologies. So we are using it many technologies, not only the Vue, and our developers like it, love it, and do it in a proper way. And also Artur playing around with types, and I think he could answer it, and maybe he could bring us some more details how to do it in Vue.
Yeah, I think it's the question is also is about the integration with the API. So actually with the backend and how to manage time safety on this integration. And well, it depends. So I would say that the first important thing is to avoid breaking changes. Sorry, because in this way, when you write down your types for the API, it won't change. But yeah, to be honest, it of course depends. We are not only using Node.js on our applications, so it's not straightforward. But I can say that, for example, when we are using GraphQL, there are automated tools that can, from the schema, just generate the types, and this is by default type safe. But for other solutions, I would say that those types are mostly written manually, or if the API has using some convention, some standard, and there are tools to automate it, we're trying to use them, but I don't think it's default. so by default, there are two things that help us to do so. So we are writing types manually and avoid breaking changes on API, which is very important here. Anything to add, Shimon?
Maybe if, for example, your project is GraphQL, then perhaps the situation is very easy because you can generate the types. And also, if you, for example, have a project that has some Node.js backend and it's written in TypeScript, then this could be addressed in some, for example, monorepo solutions and so on to have those types shared in a very easy way and convenient way. If it's not a monorepo, you can always kind of copy it, but that's not very pretty and nice. But yeah.
Okay, so and we have a last question. Another question from Glenn. Many of our projects use a raw view, not a build system like Vite. Any good testing approach for those?
So maybe let me start. So actually, in the context of migration, whether you are using Vue in this, perhaps I'm guessing a progressive enhancement approach rather than just a build system, it doesn't really matter because, for example, in ensuring the safety and confidence that we are not breaking things, The most beneficial would be end-to-end testing, which might be pretty much not related to the way you are building or not building your code. And those tests would definitely pay off much more rather than, for example, addressing them in a unit testing approach in some of your components, because basically you would be testing if your core basically scenarios work for your users, and those tests would be doing a very good job at this.
Cypress all the way.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think this is that was our last question, and we should wait more maybe for another one. Okay, another question. Last question. So from the last questions, as when I was waiting, that also appearing. Not entirely Vue related, but any tips on migrating from Webpack to Vite? This is an interesting one.
So maybe not exactly a tip, but from our experience, it's surprisingly not that effort heavy. It's usually that once you go and try out changing your build to Vite, you notice that you have much less configuration and it's quite straightforward. And mostly we didn't really find any missing pieces in the times we tried this. And we tried it both in Vue projects and React projects, and it worked for us really well. So I would try to just try it and check it out. It might be surprisingly not that difficult, and also leave you with much less configuration in your project in a much better development experience. So
yeah, there are some additional work to do when you are using some like external extension. Like for example, Vuetify has its own addition to the Vue CLI. But the thing is that the ecosystem is actually really working on that. So when you are when you notice any problems and you will just Google it, then probably you will find an answer for that. Like for example, for Vuetify, the idea is just to enable auto imports for components, and that's pretty much it. And it's not only the thing that that it is possible to do, but it can also, at the end, make your build step even more versatile and more like better because because yeah, like for example, with Vuetify, you have the full control then on how the components are imported. You can even replace them on the fly. So yeah.
Okay, so thank you for the answer, and I think that's all. So thank you everybody that you joined to our webinar about Vue migration, and I'm really happy that Artur and Szymon shared the knowledge and answered the question, and thank you all, and I think that was something like a huge piece of information right now. So if you have any questions regarding this topic, or maybe you want to contact with Monterail, you could reach to our website, and you could contact with our mobile phone contact form, or such a kind of an email, and we could answer it as well on the questions. So thank you very much for attending on this webinar.